Welcome to this webinar by the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. I am Lee Hock An, a senior fellow at the Institute and co-coordinator of the Malaysia Studies program. I'm delighted to moderate this outlook on the upcoming Sabah election, perspectives from Kinabalu to Sempurna. The mood in Malaysia this 16 September, the day the country was formed through the merger of Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore, has been rather mellow, not gloomy, perhaps a bit pensive, and distinctly not jubilant, maybe a bit distracted. Perhaps Malaysians were busy enjoying the 4-day-long weekend since the Madani government declared Monday, 15th of September, a public holiday, because having to go to work or school that day would be just unbearable. The rest of the world can only look on with envy. That ad hoc holiday, though, could also speak of a government anxious about its popularity. The pre-Malaysia Day one-off holiday was announced as part of a Penghargaan Rakyat, or People's Appreciation Package, together with other ad hoc gifts, a drop in petrol prices at the end of this month, 100 ringgit in a digital cash gift for all adult citizens, redeemable at supermarkets, and a freeze on highway toll. The economy is still humming and stability holds, but murmurings of discontent and distrust persist on the ground. Perhaps these realities are most acute in Sabah. Recent floods tragically claimed 15 lives, and maybe more, as the count may go up. The Sabah government rightly cancelled its festivities to attend to the catastrophe. This whole year, though, has seen even more scandals tied to mining license, corruption allegations. Students have protested against infrastructure failures and dry taps. The public has angrily reacted to the carelessness and incompetence of the government's handling of the tragic death of 13-year-old student Zara Khairina and rumors of cover-up. Now, PM Anwar's Malaysia Day message highlighted how 16 September signifies post-colonial independence for Sabah and Sarawak, while also, of course, championing the need for unity, solidarity, and credible leadership. Notably, he highlighted Sabah's economic potential and exhorted close federal-state ties, which could spur Sabah to enjoy the highest growth in Malaysia in 2026. Perhaps he is mindful that Sabah elections are coming up soon. Of course he is, and so are we. Now, Sabah is a beautiful region. Its people, landscape, culture, and cuisine. It is politically kaleidoscopic, but not necessarily in a lovely way. Party politics and alliances have been fluid, complicated, and bewildering for decades. What happened at the federal level post-2018 for Sabahans, probably biasalah. Business as usual, they might say. The last state election 5 years ago was also eventful, triggered as it was by Musa Aman's destabilizing return, and it was conducted under COVID restrictions and resulted in the defeat of the short-lived Warisan Pakatan Harapan government and the emergence of a new configuration of power. It's easy to get lost in the complexity and alphabet soup of Sabah's politics and political parties, but we are most privileged to have two dynamic, diligent, on-the-ground engaging scholars to help us understand their state better. What is the lay of the land? Who are the players, the parties, and the key issues on the ground? And what can we expect in the coming months? It's my privilege to introduce them now. Dr. Ano Puyok. He is a senior lecturer in politics and government studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at University Malaysia Sarawak. And he is an associate fellow at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Welcome, Arnold. And we have Dr. Vilashini Somya. She is a feminist anthropologist who heads the Gender Studies program at University Malaya and is a visiting fellow at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. So the best of ICS on Sabah for this very exciting webinar that I'm really looking forward to. And we'll hand over the time to them soon. Now, our title was From Kinabalu to Sempurna, because Arno and Vila have been conducting, well, those are already sort of areas of expertise of theirs, and they have been conducting research, revisiting places, and going to the ground on from the west side around the Kinabalu heartlands, where Arnold has spent more of his time researching, and in the areas surrounding Semporna on the east coast, that's Villa's tramping ground. And so we look forward to perspectives from coast to coast. And also Arnold will start off with more of a macro overview of Sabah as a whole before then delving into the issues more on the west side. And then we'll hand it over to Villa for her perspectives and from her fieldwork, exciting stuff from the East. So just before that, though, some housekeeping rules. We are invoking the Chatham House rules. So please do not share any of the proceedings without naming our speakers. But if you do so, please get their permission beforehand, and you can find their contact information through their public profiles online. And also for posing questions, please use the Q&A function and reserve the chat function only for raising technical matters. And so without further ado, let me invite Arno to kick off our substantive proceedings.
Thank you, Hans. So let me share my slide first. So is it visible now?
Yes, good. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you to my friend Hok On as our moderator this afternoon, and also to my fellow researcher and speaker and friend, a fellow Sabahan from KK, Dr. Villa. How are you, Dr. Villa? And also to everyone who are here listening to this seminar. So the topic of my presentation is Sabah state election, dynamics, flashpoint, and trajectories. So these are the issues that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I'll start with the introduction. Then I will say a bit on the key players that are currently trying to shape Sabah politics. When I talk about key players, do not forget that in Sabah we have local-based coalition as well as national-based coalition, unlike in Sarawak, whose politics is very much shaped by local-based parties. And I'm going to talk also about political flashpoints, which may shape the outcomes of the coming election, and sentiment on the ground based on my fieldwork, especially in the interior of Keningau, Gabungan. I also went to areas like Papar, Sipitang, Kota Merudu, or even Kudat. And I'm going to share with you all what are the current sentiment on the ground, which may also shape the outcomes of the election, and some pressing issues that are also important for us to discuss, possible outcomes based on the current political trajectory of Sabah. And last but not least, I will conclude my presentation. Now, if you look at the current scenario in Sabah, what we are seeing today is quite similar to what GPS was experiencing in 2018. Because after leaving Barisan Nasional, the former leaders of Barisan Nasional managed to form a local-based coalition, GPS. And in 2018, GPS managed to win the state election, and they win victoriously. They basically dominate the state legislative assembly in Sarawak. And with that political leverage, they were able to push for the fulfillment of MS63. Not only that, they were also able to bring MS63 to mainstream politics, not only in Sabah, Sarawak, but also in Peninsular Malaysia. So what we are seeing in Sabah is that GRS is trying to emulate what GPS is doing in Sarawak. That is why GPS believes in the fact that if they want to fulfill MS63, and they want to help chart the direction of the country's politics, then they have to be as strong as GPS. So this is the aim of many leaders of GRS in Sabah. Now, that is why this election is important, because this will be the first time that GRS and especially Gagasan will be contesting in the election. But then again, it will be a big test for them. Number one, the issue is whether they can rival BN or Warisan, because their electoral strength has never been tested before. So this is the first time that the electoral strength will be tested. So the big question is whether they can rival BN and Warisan, and also interestingly, whether or not they can push for this Sabah for Sabahan sentiment. Because in Sarawak, when we look at GPS, they are able to do it. They're able to push for the Sarawak first sentiment and manage to get the support of a majority of Sarawakian to push for this Sarawak first sentiment. Because GRS is trying to do that. So it would be very interesting for us to see whether this Sabah for Sabahan sentiment, Sabah first sentiment that is promoted by GRS is popular, especially among Sabahans. And given the fact that in Sabah, we have national-based parties like UMNO, Bersatu, or even PAS. Don't forget, we have PAS in Sabah. Even though the seat that is held by PAS is a nominated seat, but don't be surprised, PAS has some following in Sabah, and whether or not they can shape the electoral outcome, that is another issue for us to discuss. So the aim of this paper or this particular presentation is I want to unpack the dynamics, share with you all some of the political flashpoints, and what would be the trajectory of Sabah politics prior to the election that will be held very soon. So again, very quickly, these are the major players in Sabah's political scene. These are the local coalition. For those of you who may not have the familiarity of Sabah politics, so we have Gabungan Rakyat Sabah, consisting of local-based party like PBS, SAPP, PCS, TA, PHRS, LDP, and USNO. But then again, if you look at GRS does not have an anchor party like GPS in Sarawak. When you look at GPS in Sarawak, they have a strong anchor party, PBB, and PBB is able to get the support of the key major ethnic groups in Sarawak, unlike GRS in Sabah. And GRS is also quite weak, especially among the Gagasan Dusun group. That is why they need the support of Gagasan Dusun-based parties like PBS and STAR. We also have Warisan. Warisan is a standalone local-based party. And Gagasan NKDM, Parti Kesejahteraan Masyarakat Malaysia, or Sabah, can't remember the full name, which is also a standalone local-based party in Sabah with a focus on Gagasan Dusun. Now, the thing about Sabah politics is that even though you have all these multi-based parties in outlook, but most of them rely on the support of one particular ethnic group, like PBS, STAR, or even KDM. They say they are multiracial, but they rely on the support of the Gagasan Dusun voters. So these are the local-based parties, these are the local players. And interestingly, also in Sabah, as I mentioned earlier, unlike in Sarawak, you have UMNO, which is part of Barisan Nasional. PBRS is also part of Barisan Nasional. You have PH, consisting of TKR, DAP, and APCO. And interestingly, we also have PN in Sabah, consisting of parties like PAS and Bersatu. I've written a paper on whether or not national-based parties can outshine local-based parties in Sabah. So if you are interested, you can read more about the sentiment on the ground, especially the clash between the local and national-based parties. Because my argument is that, contrary to what many people believe in Sabah, that national-based parties will be wiped out in the coming election, I do not think that is the case. I think they still have big following. UMNO in particular has strong machinery in most of the areas, especially in the West Coast and in Muslim Putra area. So I do not think they would be wiped out anytime soon, even after the election. So again, as I mentioned to you earlier, if you want to read more about key players in Sabah and who was going to shape the coming election, so you can refer to this article published in October. So, what are the current flashpoint? I call it flashpoint number one is whether to contest in the election alone or whether to form a coalition with um, national-based parties. Because for GRS is basically in a dilemma whether to contest in the election as a standalone local election or to partner with its federal allies. Because when you look at the sentiment on the ground, I went to this AGM of GRS, and when I look at the sentiment of most of the members of GRS or of Gagasan, they wanted GRS and Gagasan to go for the election alone, just like what GPS was doing in Sarawak. Very strong sentiment to go for solo or to contest in the election as a standalone local-based coalition. In fact, PBS and STAR, the key members of GRS, really wanted for GRS to go for the election on its own, not to have a partnership with any national-based coalition. So this is a scenario, whether to go for the election as a standalone coalition or to commit to a partnership with either BN or PH. That's number one. Number two is seat negotiation. We all know that the negotiation between GRS and Gagasan and UMNO are currently not going anywhere. And the reason for that is because Gagasan wants to contest in seats where those seats were won under UMNO before, prior to 2018. So because of this dual incumbency issue, what we will be seeing is a high likelihood that Gagasan and UMNO will contest among each other, especially in the Muslim Bumiputera seats in the East Coast. So if that happens, my observation is that that is going to be advantageous to Warisan. Gagasan want to contest in the seats where UMNO was the incumbent before, and UMNO, on the other hand, wanted to claim those seats. And IGG was reportedly had in mind initially that he wanted to swap those seats, but he was basically opposed by member of Gagasan. So I think whatever it is, Gagasan will surely contest against UMNO in many of the Muslim Bumiputera seats in the East Coast area. IGG is positive about working together with Pakatan Harapan, but what is not clear is how many seats will be given to Pakatan Harapan. But what is clear for now is that GRS will be contesting in more than 50 seats. But what is not clear is how many seats will be going to PH. Now, the reason why this number is important is that I think GRS is aiming to win as many seats as possible. The magic number is 37. Why 37? Because that is the threshold for a simple majority in the DUN. So if you want to be a dominant local-based coalition, you have to get more than 37 seats. Or if you can get 2/3, that would be even better. That's the magic number, 37 seats. That is why GRS is targeting more than 50 seats to contest in the coming election. Now, flashpoint number 3, I think Warisan is watching quietly and hoping for the talks between GRS, PH, and BN to collapse. Because if GRS, GRS, BN, and PH contest against each other, this will be advantageous to Warisan, especially in the Muslim Putra area. Um, and I would not be surprised if Perikatan Nasional, especially Bersatu, uh, also gain some, I will not say gain substantially, but I will not be surprised if they are able to split the support in the Muslim Putra areas, especially in areas where the candidates for GRS, BN, and PH are weak. Plus point number 4, in the Kadazan Dusun area. I think this is where um, the battle will be interesting because KDM could emerge as a potential challenger to PBS and STAR. KDM, as you all know, KDM was established by Peter Anthony. For KDM has been saying that they could provide the alternative to PBS and STAR because PBS and STAR are part of GRS and GRS is cooperating with PH. So their argument is that PBS and STAR cannot say that they are championing Sabah for Sabahan because they are cooperating with PH. Whereas KDM is a standalone local based party contesting in the election as independent, and they are not influenced by anyone, including national based parties. So it is seen as a new alternative, especially among the Kadazan areas and especially in areas where PBS is particularly weak. And PKR may gain if PKR can build strong candidates, especially in areas where PBS is particularly weak. And then what is the sentiment on the ground? Very quickly, as we discussed just now with Villa and on before we start the seminar, when you talk to people in Sabah, they say, what for going for this election? And in fact, in our roundtable discussion with many people in the kampong, they say, no matter how much we analyze Sabah politics, no matter how much we say about it, at the end of the day, it will be the same elites who will win the election. So same all, same all. In Kadazan Dusun, they say, iri om iri. It's going to be the same thing again. So what's the point? But for me, why this election is in particular important is because, again, as I mentioned earlier, it is a test for the Sabahan sentiment. Because this sentiment is brought by GRS, the ruling coalition. And it will be interesting whether the sentiment can be sustained by this ruling coalition. Because if we still remember in 1980s and 1990s, the same sentiment was promoted by PBS. And PBS was crushed by the federal government under then Prime Minister Mahathir. That is why Haji G is very cautious about fighting for Sabah first, but at the same time, he wants to maintain a good relationship with the federal government under Anwar. So, very quickly, what are the pressing issues in Sabah? I think Villa will be talking about this later. Infrastructure woes, infrastructure problems. I think we all know this. Lack of water issue, or water supply, electricity, the issue of Pen Borneo, and so on and so forth. Corrupting allegations. This is going to be a very big issue as well. And rising youth discontent as a result of the Zara Kairina case. And again, as we discussed just now, on the aftermath of the flood disaster, and how is the government going to deal with this? A lot of people have shown their frustration, dissatisfaction in terms of the way the government responds to it. And this could also delay the election because I was told by a lot of people that they're going to call for the election, the resolution this year, this week, especially after Malaysia Day. And this could be used as a reason to delay it probably until after mid November when the June dissolves automatically. What are the possible outcomes? Again, this is based on my observation, my conversation with many people on the ground. Uh, I would say there will be no outright majority. So it's going to be the same thing again. No party, no coalition will be able to get more than 37. But we can speculate three scenarios. Number one, GRS alone, but depending on whether GRS can get more than 37 seats, possibly GRS plus PH and DN following the model at the federal level. And also possibly GRS and Warisan because they want to ride on this local-based sentiment. But for me, it's very unlikely because for some people in VRS, the common enemy is Warisan. So they wouldn't want to get Warisan into the coalition and form a government together. But again, we never know because some people say that politics is the game of the impossible, right? So for me personally, what I would like to see more is the direction of the Kadazan Dusun vote. Because I would say the Kadazan Dusun or even the Chinese votes will be very, very decisive. Because for the Kadazan Dusun, they have more options in the form of this KDN, this new party, and also in the form of PKR. And if the votes swing, so this could end the dominance of Star and PBS, especially in the Kadazan Dusun area. I will show to you later why in the Kadazan Dusun area. The Chinese may return to Warisan because based on our conversation with the Chinese observation, some are not happy with PH because PH talks about reform. The AP talks about reform, but they've been very quiet about the alleged corruption implicating not ordinary member of GRS, key member of GRS. So we may see a swing of the Chinese votes back to Warisan. And as I mentioned earlier, corruption issue is a big issue, especially among Chinese and especially among the young voters and the fence seekers. So as I mentioned to you earlier, in the Kadazan Dusun votes, if you look, these are the key Kadazan Dusun votes, more than 60% Kadazan Dusun voters. When you look at the change in the popular votes, or even in the percentage of popular votes obtained in 2018 and 2020, it's less than 60%. And in the Kadazan Dusun votes areas, and especially areas held by PDS, you see a lot of marginal seats. And it is in these marginal seats where parties like PKR or even parties like KDM can have a lot of chances to defeat PBS, especially, or even Star, but especially PBS. So this is what I call as ethnic plurality seats, where none of the voters, ethnic voters, form more than 50% of the voting population. Again, this is where the contest will be very, very competitive. Interesting to see a lot of marginal seats here, and this is the area where new parties can make a difference as well, or even new candidates. This is the next area. Again, a very highly competitive area where Warisan can go in and challenge the AP, especially in area where there are a lot of Chinese voters. Now, in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, even though people say that this is going to be the same election, the same elite will reappear, but I would say it is important election because we will see whether Sabah Persabahan, Sabah sentiment can be sustained or not, especially under the ruling party. And for me, based on what we see now, the outcomes of the coming election will depend on seat negotiation. Also, will depend on the direction of the Kadazan Dusun and Chinese vote and the credibility of GRS, especially in terms of how it tries to clear its names after the corruption allegation implicating GRS leader, and also in terms of how GRS is able to address issue related to infrastructure and issue related to people sentiment on the ground. So with that talk on, I end my presentation and I'm happy to respond to any question after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold. Yeah, I mean that was very, very clear and at the same time comprehensive. You've given us overview and also lots of insights, and I'm just glad that you brought it up in that thematic way, and also a lot of flavor with the photos and your drawing on your conversations and your fieldwork. So thank you so much. Yes, prompted a lot of questions in me, and I'm sure in all our viewers as well. So you can please begin to form the questions and put them in the Q&A box. Now we hand over to Vila for her presentation. Take us to the east.
Thanks so much for that, Hoon, and thank you also so much, Arnold, for really setting the stage and helping us get there. Just give me a second, everybody. Can I just check? Can everybody see these slides?
Good.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Again, thanks so much, Arnold. My fellow Sabahan brethren with me on this stage. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity. I want to say thank you very much to ISIS for organizing this. Of course, it's always an important time to talk about any part of Borneo, and having Sabah sort of central for this is very important. But before I start, I just for Sabahans who are with us and friends who follow Sabah very closely, I just like to take a moment to sort of remember many of our friends in Sabah who are greatly impacted by the floods. It's an incredibly devastating time, and for anybody who has the capacity to help, everyday Sabahans with this horrible catastrophe, I really urge you to do so. And for those like Arno and myself, our heart is constantly back home. So it's very important that I start off this way. So friends, let me first begin by saying that I thank you very much. And what I'm presenting to you is really, as you call, fresh from the oven. I have just only less than 10 days ago returned from a very, very long journey around the East Coast, where I'd like to share with you some of what I call the ground truth, right? And really, it's trying to understand and trying to get a taste of where the upcoming state elections are going to be from an East Coast perspective. Now, I need to start by saying that oftentimes when we do talk about Sabah politics, we tend to forget that Sabah is an incredibly big state, territory, whichever it is, whichever word. My late grandmother used to call it negara, or its own country, and for many of us who are from Sabah, we also still tend to think of it that way, simply because the sort of diversity that comes from Sabah is really huge. And this is why it's very important for us to understand where the east coast of Sabah is coming from with this. Now, forgive me, I think I have to give you a little bit of context before I get to the meat, simply because, again, for many people who are very interested in Malaysian politics, there's often a failure to really understand both Sabah and particularly Sarawak and Sabah politics, I think, simply because it's a completely different game altogether. But I need to start off by saying that Sabah's general political background is that in participating and coming together with Sarawak and even Singapore at that period of time to form the Malaysian Federation with Malaya, somewhere it was sort of put together through a set of documents called MA63, the Malaysian Agreement 1963. This is important because in 1976 there was a rewording of that argument of that article, that agreement, which kind of reduced us from equal partners to states. This, of course, has limited our control within our own territory, and it's definitely weakened local political and the economic environment. And this bleeds to the way in which we are practicing politics today in Sabah. So essentially, Sabah's socio-political landscape is really rooted in decades of neglect. Any Sabahan can tell you and tell you in great detail about the mismanagement of different administrations have had with their various political agenda. And this is, of course, marked by frequent defections and coalition realignments, which we in Sabah like to call frogging, or in the local term, mengatak, right? Comes from the keyword katak, which is really the phenomenon of massive party hopping. So when we talk about Sabah and its ability to self-determine, I suppose one thing we have to understand is that coalition dynamics is pretty much shaped, and Arnold talked about this to a huge degree, by historical marginalization. It's deep-rooted with a yearning for greater self-determination, failing as we go ahead, failing as we fall ahead. And so when it comes to political choice, it's always shaped by competing incentives, it's shaped by shifting voter demands, and really it's about balancing local legitimacy with federal ties. So when we go over to the East Coast, however, this has always been a really contested zone. I'll get to this really hot map in the corner here in the left in a while. But when we talk about the East Coast is always sort of branded with this notion of, it's not really Sabah in that sense, simply because of huge numbers of stateless, irregular migrant, undocumented people. We need to understand that Sabah is essentially situated between Indonesia on one side and the Philippines on the other. And this has left us with historical geopolitical contestations over territory, sovereignty, nationhood, even till today. So this huge notion of citizenship is a hotbed conversation in the local politics in Sabah, right? We have this narrative going on for years. And this conversation is that citizenship is a pathway for anybody who's a non-citizen to sort of like come in and join the Malaysian and to be a Malaysian. And this is conditioned by post-colonial geopolitical struggles. So any government that comes into power has to manage multiple generations of, either refugees or people with IMM13 permits. Google that if you're really not sure what that is, or anybody who kind of has a very complicated history of being a citizen. And there's no permanent solution. I can't give you the answer. There's been many solutions and it's never been met with great confidence on all fronts. And so when it comes to the East Coast, because of that, this is where Warisan, the party that Arnold has sort of given a lot of signposting to, has sort of come in. The East Coast has been said to be a Warisan stronghold for a long time. However, I kind of need to remind us that, even in the last few elections, Warisan didn't win outright. It's always within that aftermath in which coalitions are made stronger after elections and not during, simply because of defection, right? So you see many people essentially frogging. UMNO members, UPCO affiliates have been doing that. So the result was that Warisan did secure control of the state government for a while, but the tenure was only about 2 years. And essentially their challenge is that they have to face a lot of internal and external problems. Now, separate from that is that the East Coast of Sabah is also known, I think, by people who are working in security, particularly in Sabah, as the S zone. And I just need to remind you of this, that the S zone spreads all the way from Pitas, Kota Marudu up here down to Beluran, Sandakan, Kinabatangan, Lahadatu, Kunang, and all the way down to Tawau. This red area. It has also been described as, its own special constituency. I won't get into that now, but we can always get into that in the conversation. And it's essentially the security zone launched by then Prime Minister Najib in 2013 as a result of the Lahad Datu incursion. The S zone is manned by ESCOM, which is the Eastern Sabah Security Command, which is based in Lahad Datu. I will return to that a little later. So again, just to really go back to some numbers, just to give us an idea about where the elections have been, I'm going to just draw from numbers from 2018 and 2020. When we do see the sort of seats, you see the change here simply because of redelineation that has happened in the 2 years. In 2018, what was called the Warisan Plus coalition went up against the BN coalition. Of course, Warisan won very strong. But later on, 2 years later, I think the competition was then between Warisan Plus and JRS, or Gabungan Rakyat Sabah, at that time BNPN and PBS. And so the East Coast essentially remained a very strong Warisan base. But I think here's the danger with relying too much on bases, is that other parties can make inroads, right? And GRS certainly did. So ultimately, this is where I think Warisan lost the state. But again, losing the state today never means lost forever in a place like Sabah, because things change very rapidly, and it is really the site of great political drama. And if any of you are making a movie out of it, it will be a very long movie, is what I'm trying to say. So let's just pull from things that are happening currently in the news in 2025, right? Why do we constantly go back to Warisan when we talk about the East Coast? We go back to it simply because Warisan is a name in that place. It's undeniable. Unlike the other side of the coast that Arnold has given us a really good idea about, where I conducted fieldwork, essentially tells us that the constant hang-up continues and remains Warisan. So as you can see here, Warisan has been said to pose to be a strong challenge to areas that are DAP strongholds, meaning to say that, just as Arnold has pointed out, Chinese voters that are traditionally DAP supporters have been said or are seen to be increasingly leaning towards Warisan, simply because they might be interested in a much more state-centered party. There is, of course, these claims that Warisan is making, that they are not just gaining new members, but they are essentially pulling and getting new members from PKR, PBS, UMNO, and Gagasan, particularly in that part of the coast. Warisan also wants to make at this very moment, and again, nothing is set in stone, but at this moment, the common narrative is that they will go independent. They want to use their own logo. They believe that they have that kind of following. And that they are not interested in any backdoor alliance at the moment. And lastly is that when it comes to polls, right, essentially we now see also national, or should I say federal parties like PN really reaching out, wanting to appeal to Warisan about, having these much more formalized alliances before the election starts. So now let's go back to what it is that I did. As you know, I'm an anthropologist, which means I'm a professional kopitiamer. I hang out in coffee shops and I have coffee shop conversations all the time. And so, ISIS was very kind to believe in the dream and said, go ahead, Villa, go and enjoy yourself in the coast for a couple of days. And the point of the fieldwork that I wanted to do this particular year was to really look at three things only, really moving on from what it is that we were looking on. Number one, the very clear suspicion in the East Coast is that the youth are participating, but at what capacity? So I wanted to speak to young people and have a conversation with them about tensions between their aspirations, the form of resistances that they're talking about, and political apathy. Now, having done fieldwork together with a scholar, Masna Muhammad, many years ago, was that, we also worked a lot with women as community mobilizers. And this is true, especially in areas that are not just Muslim-centric, but have had a deep relationship with, say, UMNO strongholds. And so I really wanted to return to see where it is that women were as community mobilizers. Were they still local leaders? And how were they alternative points of authority in shaping local electoral behavior? In the East Coast, particularly with certain ethnic groups that are found there, women do rule the roost, and they do have a very strong position to take in sort of influencing local politics about how it is one should vote. But most importantly, I wanted to see the East Coast independent as an electoral battleground. The ethnic diversity in Sabah is so great. It's so great. The joke is that you'll never meet a single mono-ethnic Sabahan, right? And this is true throughout Sabah in that sense. But the diversity of ethnic groups in the East Coast is an interesting one that often doesn't make it to the mainstream of Sabah conversations. So we were speaking to a great deal of different people. We wanted to see how the migrant effect was still, a huge narrative that influenced politics as well. And also, what kind of grassroots voices were anticipated and shaping the 2025 state elections. So just to let you know, these were the four main sites that I visited. I went to Sandakan, Tawau, Semporna, and Lahad Datu. But I just wanted to add in there that there was an unplanned visit that I made to Kunap. Kunap, as you can see, is situated here between Semporna and Lahad Datu. Simply because of the heat and the momentum of the Justice for Zara rally. I'm going to do a shameless plug for those of you who are interested in the power of Justice for Zara as a movement. read the fulcrum piece that will come out next week. Okay. And if not, I will just talk unashamedly about it after that. So very quickly on the methodology, I ended up speaking to as many as 40 people. A lot of my work really derives from in-person interviews and observational ethnography. As a Sabahan, I speak painfully as a Sabahan. So, I'm both an outsider and insider by way of the way I do work. And just like Arnold, these are a couple of pictures of me in the field because, I just wanted to show off and just show you that I spent a lot of time, as I said, hanging around in coffee shops, talking. Overall, the work was throughout 20 days of non-stop field work. That's 730 kilometers on road. There were tons of voice recordings and field notes, and of course, as you can see, photos. And outside of official and formal interviews were ethnography in markets, in cafes, in public spaces, because we know more than anything, public spaces in Sabah are incredibly political spaces. So let's get down to the meat of it, right? So what are the things that I've learned in these 4 sites? Let's start with Sandakan. I always think it's important to put the ethnic composition in these spaces simply because, again, I think it's important for representation. But I think to add to that also is that Sabah the Sabah state government has been accused of, problematic categorization of ethnic groups, and I think it's important for us to be able to see how it is that people are self-identifying and the kind of ethnic identifiers that they come with to the table. So as you can see, I spoke to people from the Bugis Tidung Bidayu. Yes, there are Bidayu people and Bajau people in Sandakan. Some of the emerging themes that are coming out in Sandakan. And before I start, please allow me to state also that while the East Coast has been sort of seen as a homogenized space in the way they react to politics, my findings show that this is not true. Every district comes with its own set of concerns and issues because they are made out of very different compositions of people. The political and the geographical terrain differs. So over in Sandakan, a little bit up north, closer to the Philippines, is that for a lot of first-time voters, and Sandakan seem to have tons of first-time voters, views voting as, new, it's really shaped by ethnicity. What's interesting is that family ties, right? That they are cautious that support for the government is really tied to the way families are also voting. So if you've had a group of families that's received a considerable amount of aid from Hajiji's government at the moment, they will continue to vote along that simply because, the gravy train feels support to some degree. For many women, of course, they are influenced by politics, particularly via NGOs. I would say that the civil society space in Sandakan is relatively huge, almost rivaling that of Tawau. So, a lot of community roles really influence the way in which they are speaking about politics. When it comes to the stateless or non-citizen community, and this is new to me, and this became a little bit of a theme throughout my visits in other districts, is that there seems to be a growing resentment towards non-citizens and undocumented persons. While there's still empathy towards children, the concern is that a lot of the resources, such as hospitals, for example, has to now be shared with the growing number of non-citizens or migrants in the area. And this has brewed some sort of resentment, and we'll get to that in my conclusion in a while. And when it comes to party politics, right, I think it's always an issue of members of certain political parties really being divided by main objectives. There's no clarity, there's no transparency about these objectives that are there. And I think younger voters want that clarity from the very beginning. So this is, I'm only going to mention this once, but we can talk about this later in the Q&A. Frustration and anger towards very poor infrastructure management is talked about. I drove in what was sort of not fully formed version of the Pan-Borneo Highway in those areas, and I can completely understand, simply because things like roads and electricity and water are constant battles in the everyday lives of voters in these parts of the East Coast. It is throughout Sabah, but I think particularly in spaces where public transportation doesn't even exist, this becomes a very, very big problem. Over in Tawau, of course, some of the very interesting things that emerged was that while women, of course, continue to really influence the way in which their families and their children should vote, women don't want to vote in women. And I think this is a very important point. A lot of people are often thinking that women should vote women in. And this is not the case simply because a lot of them maybe internalize very sexist views about other women, even though they claim that they are very dissatisfied with male leaders. What I think a lot of women have talked about really wanting to see are young voters, simply because young voters understand women needs at a far better capacity than maybe other women from different classes, right? Tawa was the first place where we met quite a number of young people who've talked about undi rosak, or spoiling the ballot, which again, in retrospect, I think it completely makes sense simply because of the heat and the kind of influences that are coming from Indonesia. Tawau is very close to the Indonesian border, and a lot of those influences were coming through simply because, as you can see here, the ethnic composition of many of the people we spoke to were either Bugis or Melayu Bugis. And this is important because both Bugis and Melayu Bugis were official ethnic groups found in their IC. One would think that somebody would only be called Bugis. Why is there a Melayu Bugis versus a Bugis? Simply because Bugis people are not considered indigenous to Sabah. On the front of Warisan and GRS as a topic that had come out in Tawau was that I think the conversation was that they saw both these parties as being very aggressively building loyalty in the times that it was not election period via aid or patronage. So it was an issue of using things like banchi, right? Going out and getting that sort of stuff to sideline stateless and stateless residents and to secure votes of actual respondents. And again, the whole mention of the lack of competent candidates, as Arnold had also mentioned earlier on, there are no competent candidates. They're just the candidates that we have. So, you know, it's about getting the best you can at that moment. When we went over to Sampurna, one very interesting thing is something called Bajau identity politics. And I think this stands out, is asserted in opposition to other ethnic group, particularly Bugis, Suluk or Orang Sungai representation in that space. I think the Bajau community particularly wanted to stand out differently simply because you know, they have a very specific way of looking at campaign handouts. When I spoke to a village head who was herself of Bajau descent, she encouraged the people in her village to accept all forms of handout because all handouts are their money anyway. And I think that sort of way of looking at politics really influences the way in which they speak to corruption. You know, corruption is there, it's anticipated, it's even acceptable to a certain terrain. As long as some of the gravy train comes back our direction, we will still decide on who goes up later on. At the point when I went to Sampurna, this was really at the height of grassroots dissent. Movements like No Justice, No Merdeka or Justice for Sarah, for example, mobilized thousands at that time in the East Coast to a point that, you know, far exceeded other parts of Sabah. And in Sampurna particularly, it was a way also for, I think, stateless community members to also participate with local respondents. But I still need to state, Sampurna is still a Warisan stronghold. It is sustained by Shafi Abdal's personal charisma that is talked about everywhere, in every corner that you go to, despite critiques of him for issues of favoritism that he had led previously. So a very famous line that many people from Sampurna will tell me is, and it's a bit grotesque, so I'm going to give you a trigger warning, that even if you beheaded Shafi Abdal, and I'm not calling for it, his torso would still win the elections. And I found that, you know, and they would say that in jest, but I think the point that they were trying to get across is that Shafi Abdal wins Sampurna without any question. And lastly, I returned to Lahad Datu, where essentially, as I had mentioned earlier on, Lahad Datu is the heart of the ESCOM movement. And so when it comes to issues of crime and control, I think authorities are, or at least presence of authorities is very, very strong. So for many locals who spoke to me, it's always an issue of talking about politics in a language that's about mistrust, right? Because of heavy surveillance. The climate in Lahad Datu differs from other districts, I must say, simply because there is citizens talk about voting very warily. and under constraint and feel that as that they cannot fight against a deep state that exists in that space, and they might not have the same amount of freedom or at least a leeway the way that districts like Sandakan or Tawau might have. However, I must say, as somebody who began her work working in Lahad Datu almost 15 years ago and returning today, I would dare say Lahad Datu has experienced the most amount of gentrification and development compared to all other districts. And hearing that there's still a huge issue with mistrust and surveillance despite the kind of change is, for me, very, very fascinating. So I just want to conclude, because I don't want to take too much time, and I hope, Hok An, I haven't sapped up everyone's time, but I want to conclude it with 5 general ideas here. And again, I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback from all of you, and even Arnold and Hok An after this. Is that number 1, youth in the East Coast are a very huge potential swing force. I want to draw attention to a group of students called the UMS Gerakan Mahasiswa. UMS stands for University Malaysia Sabah. And their presence throughout the East is incredibly strong, especially with young people. They have a strong political presence, especially with grassroots communities, influencing them to think along the lines of voting very critically. Their core narrative is very simple. And, I think with the last Justice for Zara movement, it's obvious that I think, almost anarchic, if I must say. It promotes anti-Hajiji and even anti-Musa Aman sentiments, because they position themselves, their position is that one must be in opposition as a key agenda in the coming in the coming elections, simply because the East Coast has always been in opposition with the rest of Greater Sabah. And the influence here is that it's shaping youth voting patterns and behaviors in the East Coast. When it comes to women, I think they are changing the tides when it comes to voting, but certainly not at the capacity of young people. The shift in preference is that, as I said, women no longer prioritize seeing other women in power. I think there is a great interest for youth leadership. The implication here is that winning parties might be those that are able to champion younger candidates. And I believe parties like apart from Warisan, even local DAP and PKR groups are also playing with that idea of bringing in younger candidates. The problem is that there's a vacuum. There's not enough candidates to go about, because being a political candidate requires you to speak with a certain authority. So I think youth candidates has essentially been seen better at addressing women's needs. 2 of the major things that were brought up were birthing facilities at hospitals and period poverty, rather than elite women politicians, which of course in Sabah has been the case. When it comes to Warisan and Shafi Abdal, it has always been framed that they have made some grave errors and mistakes in the past. The perception here is that supporters argue that Warisan made mistakes that requires a kind of punishment, a kind of scolding, right? But one that requires them to be ready enough for the coming elections. And the key mistakes that have been identified by the 40-odd people that I've spoken to is that A, Shafi Abdal and Warisan had concentrated way too much of their power amongst their own people with nepotism and so on and so forth. And they didn't plan for much more holistic sort of sharing of power. And number 2, a great over-reliance on the presence of migrants and not being able to tackle and not reading the room enough about how to tackle issues of migration. When it comes to party dominance, they are essentially tested by grassroots dissatisfaction. So I need to say that these emerging movements, particularly Justice for Zara, which then kind of gave birth momentarily to No Justice, No Merdeka, essentially led many voters to reject ruling party campaign handouts initially. But again, none of this is permanent. A lot of things change the closer we get to elections. I need to state that things change constantly on the ground, which is why it's so difficult to, I think, pinpoint how Sabah elections work. But the implication here is that political parties saw these movements as something that they needed to hijack, right, in order to change something in their branding, to either appear much more empathetic and people-centric, which they have been essentially accused of. And lastly, where do the migrant community stand in this? It is a contested terrain. There's a lot of scapegoating that's happening, particularly by residents who are from the East Coast, especially locals who used to kind of accept this pro-migrant label for many years, which is carried out by and large over in the West Coast, right? If you are paying attention to KDM politics, it's always about flushing out the migrant community. So East Coasters have been accused of being pro-migrant for a long time, but at this round, there seems to be a very strong resentment because they generally see no benefit or with tacking on that sort of pro-migrant identity. And the direct frustration here is then taken on to the stateless community that they live with. The risk is that, parties might sort of utilize this anti-stateless migrant, or a variety, or sort of demonstrating the nuances of using that in different ways as a bargaining chip to win votes. And I think, unlike before, East Coast voters now are expressing very strong disdain for non-citizen presence. So, I think support can be likely for parties that promise harsher action beyond the repatriation system that is in place. That is all I have to say. And as I end all my talks, terima kasih ya.
Terima kasih, Bah. Thank you so much, Vila. That was very, very insightful, and yeah, you really brought us, on the road with you, and to give us a flavor, right, of those opinions and sentiments on the ground, and that's just incredibly helpful. So we have about half an hour for Q&A. Let me just launch right into it. To just a set to Arnold first. So I think these are generalizations, but I think it would be fair to say that there are these anti-ruling class, anti-elite, which is directed at the Sabahans, right? Sentiments. And then there's the Peninsula and Sabah for Sabahans kind of sentiments. So there's somewhat in tension, because one is more of a purely local issue, and then one is more directed with the federation and broader, in the broader context. And for some, it would clearly benefit the local Sabah-based parties, but if there are these sentiments that are directed against the Sabah elites, then presumably that gives some room as well for the national parties like PH, right? And UMNO. So how do you see that dynamic playing out, anti-Sabah elite and the anti-Peninsula? I want to touch on another part of, so some of this is reflecting on things that Vila had brought up about incumbency advantage. So far, what you've said about HGG and GRS is perhaps more tilted towards disadvantages, but yet, as she pointed out, right, the state has resources and patronage. So can you comment about incumbency advantages for HGG and GRS? So maybe just kick off with that.
Yeah, thank you, On. For those people who are strong supporters of GRS, local-based parties, they know for a fact that most of the problems that we face in Sabah are due to our own leaders doing. And if you look at the history of Sabah from 1970s, 1980s, under our own local-based parties, many of the problems that we face were caused by our own leaders. But these strong supporters believe in the fact that Sabah can only be represented by Sabahans, local-based parties, because they always look at Sarawak. Because Sarawak is prosperous, because Sarawak is led by a local-based party. That's number one. And number two, there's also this sentiment, a very strong sentiment against the Malayans, they call it, right? And I would not say that everything goes back to Sabah and everything should be, we all should blame on the Sabah leaders. Some of our problems are also caused by the federal leadership, which we need to address. But because of the strong Sabah for Sabahan sentiment, strong Sabah first sentiment, the strong supporters of local-based parties believe that Sabah should be led by local-based party. And when you talk to the youth, and especially the fence-sitters, so the fence-sitters have already opened their mind. They believe that whoever is put there in the position of leadership, that person should be credible, that person should be transparent, and should be ethical to lead Sabah, irrespective of whether he is from the local base or national base party. I think for most of the young people that we have approached, this seems to be the sentiment. And if we talk to the fence sitters, The Undi 18 group, again, this is the sentiment. As I mentioned to you earlier, I've written to say to see whether the national parties can be the alternative to local-based parties. I think they can. They can, provided they can package their MS63 agenda to suit the local needs. And if they say they want to give autonomy to local-based parties, right? They should give autonomy to local-based parties. Like, for instance, when UMNO says that it wants to give local autonomy, they should give UMNO Sabah the local autonomy to operate on its own in Sabah. The same goes to PKR, for instance. But it doesn't help when you say you are giving local-based the autonomy, but then everything is operated at the federal level. So this is the cause of dissension, especially among Sabahans who are supporting national.
You see HGG and GRS holding, in what ways do they have that? And are they, providing?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's one of their advantages. They are in the government. They can mobilize their resources fairly quickly. And whether or not they can do it effectively, that is another issue. But then again, this government is seen as unable to address pressing and basic issues like water issue, infrastructure issue, right? So it doesn't help when you tell Sabahans that you have managed to bring in billions in investment, but yet you are unable to address basic issues affecting the people. So that's number one. And number two, I'm not saying that GRS has not done anything on MN63, because if you look at what happened in the past few years, actually we have managed to do a lot in terms of devolving power to Sabah. But what happened is that GRS is unable to communicate this well with the general population. So we end up having a lot of Sabahans not knowing what the government is doing. So I would say GRS really needs to improve the way it communicates policy to ordinary Sabahan. So you are there not just to tell Sabah to support you, but why should we support you? So I think that is lacking.
Great, thanks so much. So let's go on. Of course, I think these days, sort of this zeitgeist issue about the youth and youth vote, and clearly, regionally, we have Nepal and Indonesia very activated, right, galvanized politically, and we see them in Sabah as well. I think maybe something that we can unpack a little bit further, and there's some interest in the questions from Fahmi Reza and also Norman Go. I think we take it for, it's a given, right? And they've already expressed it. They are already rallying and so on. But I think the more pointed question now would be, how do you think, what kind of, they could mobilize or really have that impact? In what ways and areas do you actually see them being a kingmaker? And what are some of the issues that would distinctly are youth issues, right? That you see can be, would emerge in manifestos, for instance, and really be something that will be part of this youth activism and the youth impact. So maybe Vila can start with that.
Thanks so much for that. And thanks also Fahmi and Norman for asking this question. I'm very, very fascinated and, and there's something, how do I say, there's something very moving, I think, that's happening in the youth movement in Sabah. Now, just to take a bit of a step back, is that the last time there was a huge attempt to do youth movements in Sabah was either through the Undi movement, right? So Undi 18 then translated to something called Undi Sabah. There was a little bit of that for a while. Or when Syed Sadiq's Muda came over, and somehow or other both did not really take off in that sense. I think it gave a lot of young people an idea that there could be a youth movement, but somehow or other, and I'm very happy to kind of see this. is that it's a youth movement that started in the state university in itself, UMS, and not because that they were reading philosophy in classrooms and they were learning about Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault, but really simply because it bore out of the everyday frustrations that everyday Sabahans were experiencing. No water. It's as simple as that. There was no water. You can't take a shower. You can't brush your teeth. You can't do anything, right? And I think they sort of took it to the streets in a way that has been accused of being very radical. When I had the chance to meet with the core group of Mahasiswa UMS, one thing that was expressed to me was that they didn't necessarily have the interest to get into was to influence political narrative. This is a very different, position that they take compared to the previous, Muda and Undi groups that came before them, right? About pre and during pandemic period. And so much has changed in a very short period of 5 years. But what hasn't changed are the ongoing infrastructural decays that, I was born in the 80s. I lived through Sabah where, Anil, correct me if I'm wrong, we would have these trucks come into neighborhoods to give out water. And my mother would wait outside with this huge baldi, where you had to share the amount of water, which is still ongoing till today in many places, right? And so 40 years on, if these things haven't changed, you have this group of young people who know far more than they did 20 years ago. Social media, sort of aids this kind of diffuse this anger. And more than anything, what they want to do is they want to inflict fear that they feel has been inflicted onto them for previous years. A very interesting line that was said to me was, we want to be a mirror. Mau pantul balik ketakutan. I don't want to be the center of fear. I want to mirror the fear that's been given onto us for many, many years. And I think that's essentially the strategy here. As kingmakers, they don't want to be necessarily policy makers. They want to be in the room where policy can happen. I think, and they also want to, there's a huge campaign that goes with it to influence narratives in a capacity of change that is only available in Sabah. You want to talk about having Zoom meetings that we have right now? You can only do this in KK, maybe in Sandakan. But if you're talking about people in Beluran, in Sok, in Telupit, in Nabawan, this is an impossible conversation, but young people that are hungry. So I think that conversation about being kingmakers in that political space is about awareness, it's awareness building, but the strategy is one that is, for a lack of a better term, I think, and this is not to paint them in a particular way, but it's one that is radical. And radical is not a bad thing always, right? Radical is sometimes necessary in the capacity in which frustration exists. So I think this is essentially what's happening. So I meet essentially a lot of young people, even young female students that are about to vote, that are expressing views that are almost, something that they've picked up. And I think TikTok is also a great arena for them to learn a lot of these things.
Yeah, Arno, could you briefly comment on that? Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. That is why when you look at this Zara issue, right, the youth are looking for something which they can use to tell the government that, look, this is your fault. Due to your inability to address people's problem. Because they are looking for something in which they can use to reveal the inequity or the inefficiency of the government of the day. That is why when you look at the demonstration, the Justice for Zara is not happening in one place in AK. It's happening all over Sabah.
Yeah.
And most of these demonstrations are youth-led. And the way I look at it is that this is not just about Zara. This is about a subtle message that the youth is trying to put across, especially to the ruling elite. So I look at this as a message aimed at the ruling elite.
Yeah.
To say that, look, this is due to your inefficiency as a ruling government. Not necessarily to blame the government on what's happening to Zara, but to look at it in totality, to say that, look, what happened in Sabah, all this basic issue, due to your inability to address issues well. So I think the Zara issue is a subtle message sent to the youth, to the ruling elite, not
Yeah.
necessarily because they're unhappy about the way the Zara issue is handled, but just a message that they want to share with the wider community in Sabah. Yeah.
I want to add on to what Arnold has said about
Mm.
the Justice for Zara. Just really quickly, on is that
Yeah.
a lot of it really began as grassroots movements, right? But it kind of exploded to a greater capacity simply because there are other identifiers that we have to understand here, right? There's an issue of
Mm.
remoteness and ruralness. There's also an issue of being of a particular class, and Arnold is right. Upper class ruling coalitions essentially are targeted as the problem here, but also kind of like larger maybe Muslim brethren or Bumi Putra brethren narratives that's going on. That's very different from Malaya in that sense, right? But I think if you're talking about how youth are also mobilizing, they are incredibly inclusive. They are reaching out to other youths in other states to also join them. And they are not necessarily just asking young people to participate. Families have been able to participate. Many millennial families, people in their 40s, have also kind of like heard the call for being a part of this youth movement. It is about essentially livelihoods and kinship. And I think this is a very powerful language
Yeah.
because both issues of livelihood and kinship have been compromised and corrupted in Sabah for many years.
Mm. And also, what makes it even more interesting is because I think this is a leaderless movement. You don't see any one or two leaders who are leading this demonstration everywhere. So basically, just look at Sipitang, right? I've never
Yeah.
seen any demonstration happening in Sipitang in my whole of adult life. Never. This is the first time. So I check with people in Sipitang. That's where I am from. There is no leader. The youth simply just go to the street to demonstrate. And interestingly, they know the reason why they went to the street to demonstrate. And previously, if you ask the people why they joined the Bersih movement, right? Most of them say that, well, we just want to demonstrate for the sake of demonstrating because there's something about the government we're not happy about. But in this particular demonstration, the youth know what they're doing. They said, we are demonstrating because of this particular issue. Not necessarily because of Zara issue, but because of this, as what mentioned by Vila. And the fact that it is leaderless movement, that makes it even more interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on, I know you have a question, but just one last thing. Just one last thing I need to tack on. Compared to
Yeah.
any students in this country in a public university, Sabahan students have the most to look up to if they get kicked out of universities for doing this. I just need to
Yeah.
say this. They have the most because there are no jobs waiting for them in Sabah if they get kicked out of university for being a part of this. If this happened to you in
Mm.
University of Malaya, your chances of survival is greater. So I think the risk that they bear as being a part of this movement is seen by local Sabahans. They see it and they recognize it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Sorry.
I think we are doing proportionately. I think we are spending this time because it is definitely some ferment and something real that is happening. We shall see, right, how it translates into the vote later. But yeah, there's a lot of other issues that we also want to get to, and maybe for Arnold, about leadership, right? So to emulate GPS, I mean, I think they're, of course, as you said, thinking about, well, the results would be so fabulous as they can see, right? It's very obvious in the case of GPS, but how to get there? One element there is not just the party, but leadership, and the succession there. But currently of firm and decisive leaders, currently Abang Johari, Premier of Sarawak. So
Mm.
yeah, I mean, who can credibly kind of claim that kind of mandate, I guess, vote to be that person with Hajiji, or is it a case where there can be some case for succession, a situation where succession for younger leaders like Mustafa Sakmud, Iwan Benedict, perhaps. So could you comment on the leadership, or I suppose the gaps in that, and maybe add to that about again the dynamic of federal and state. These issues about the infrastructure. Where are who are they blaming? state government more
Mm.
or federal government more? So I know you can address that. I have some questions for Villa later. Go ahead.
Mm. Yeah. So in the case of GPS, I think timing is also very important there. We need to look into the timing because if you still remember when Adnan was there as chief minister, when he spoke about MS-63 openly and critically, the federal government then was very, very weak already under Najib, right? And the Sarawak leaders took this opportunity. The timing was just right for them to take the federal government to task by saying that, look, were doing then. And it was continued by Abang Jo. Abang Jo, he institutionalized MS-63. He didn't just talk about it, but he institutionalized it. That's why under his leadership, there were a lot of devolution of power happening to Sarawak. Timing is very important. Now, whereas in Sabah, we also understand the timing, but the fact that we did not seize the moment, we didn't do like what the Sarawaki leaders were doing, so we failed. And now we are trying to catch up. And the fact, the fact of the matter is that even though we're trying to catch up very fast, but then our political system, our political environment, do not are not kind to us because we can't focus on fulfilling MSCC3. We are more focused on maintaining power, forming coalition, and also to win the election. So I think that is the main problem with Sabah. As I mentioned to you earlier, I didn't say that we don't do anything. I think the GRS government under Haji, they have done quite a lot, but it's just that they don't communicate this well to Sabahans. To tell Sabahans, look, this is what we have done since they took over power in 2020. I think they have done quite a lot. That they just need to communicate it well to the people so the people understand. You talk about leadership, right? Of course, when you ask Sabahans, they want autonomy. They always ask us to look at Singapore, to look at Brunei. Singapore, for instance, Singapore is very autonomous, very independent. That's why they are prosperous. So they want Sabah to be like Singapore. But they forget the fact that when Singapore became independent, they were led by leaders who are willing to sacrifice for the nation, leaders who are transparent, leaders who are competent. That's where you can see Singapore is now, right? So the same question you have to ask Sabahans, whether or not we have the same leaders like what you see in Singapore. So if we have competent leaders, transparent, and leaders who say no corruption, we could become prosperous like Singapore. But then this lies the problem. When people talk about autonomy, they don't talk about autonomy with accountability or with responsibility. So I think that is another issue that we need to look into. Yeah.
Good. Thanks. So there's a few questions that have touched on the Sabah for Sabahans.
Mm-hmm.
I hear a bit more from Vila, especially with all the fieldwork that you were able to draw on the sentiments on the ground. I mean, firstly, how much does it matter, and in what ways does it? I mean, some of this is, would be quite esoteric, right? MA63, and then of course people do, want to know about infrastructure and inflation and the basic needs. But just draw that out a little bit, right? How much does this notion really matter, in what ways? And are there distinct differences that you can see between the West Coast and East Coast on the theme of Sabah for Sabahans?
Oh, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference. I think the big question we have to ask is what kind of Sabah for which kind of Sabahan, right? I mean, both our presentations have told us that there are many different kinds of Sabahans. The most obvious one is there's a class difference, obviously. There's obviously tribalism that also happens in different classes. These sort of ethnic and indigenous compositions also really impact that greatly. If you follow KDM politics, for example, particularly, and I say this not as a KDM expert, I say this as a KDM voter. I vote in Moyok every year, every time there's an election. So, obviously, with my family and so on and so forth, I go back to that part of Sabah and I vote. And Sabah for Sabahan, the Sabah for Sabahan tagline in those parts primarily means a Sabah in which everybody is native to the state of Sabah, where you don't have what we call outsider lineage, for example, and you are voting along the lines for a Sabah that only gives back. So and number one is an issue of belonging. Number two is an issue of resources, right? Because we've already, for a state so rich, everybody lives so poor. And I think that's the underlying concept here that we have to understand. So when one calls for Sabah for Sabahan, it can be confused between, either being ethno-nationalistic, if, for lack of a better term, tribalistic maybe, or, really pro-Sabah in terms of wanting to protect. And both these messages have been conflated or separated differently depending on who says it. There have been, of course, very, very anti-migrant politicians in our recent elections that use that tagline as an anti-migrant narrative solely. And there are also other groups of people that use Sabah for Sabahan in a way to call for greater unity among Sabahan, simply because, as I've pointed out, the West Coast and the East Coast are not a united front. They have not been a united front. Grassroots attempts tries to make it a united front, but there's been a lot of political pitting against each other that's happened for decades. That makes it very difficult. And I think also, again, this notion that the East Coast is dangerous, is closer to the water, half of the people there are either from the Philippines or Indonesia, does not help that narrative ultimately. But I think with years gone by, the revisiting of Sabah for Sabahan then gives way to this whole language of what kind of Sabah are you talking about and which Sabahan is talking about that kind of Sabah, right? And this bleeds into the MA63 conversation, which, by the way, is a very different conversation in Sarawak. I mean, Arnold can tell us that from the get-go. We don't even have the same number of points in the MA63 between Sabah and Sarawak. There's a difference of 2. One state has 20 and another state has 18, And later on, of course, when we talk about the breaking down of MA63, ultimately there are areas in which, like I said, there's been rewording, there's been a watering down of that kind of idea of autonomy. And I agree with what Arnold is saying here, essentially, right? Autonomy, just like Sabah for Sabahan, is conflated, but I don't think anybody really wants to unpack the severity and the seriousness of what that means. Do we want autonomy that mimics Sarawak? Do we want autonomy that's completely different and it's packaged for Sabah on its own? Or do we want an autonomy that's even treading dangerously to this idea of dissent and so on and so forth, which again can be grounds for very dangerous conversation. We have had a history of that with our politicians. Pyrin has talked about that kind of autonomy in the 80s. So today, when young people hear this term of Sabah for Sabahan, I think they're still kind of trying to figure out what that means. What I do try to understand is from a very different point of view. Sabah for Sabahan is supposed to carry a much more united, inclusive language of like a better tomorrow for Sabah. But this is difficult because machinery and resources are controlled in the central body. So there's no access to that unless you are also a part of it in some way or form. And until there is more access to that kind of, that kind of resources, it's very difficult to imagine that kind of inclusivity and unity on that front, because you can't be united when you're poor. You know what I mean? You can't be united when you've got to beg for assistance all the time. And I think when it comes to the intergenerational conversation, trying to have an open dialogue about Sabah for Sabahan, I think this is where there's a kind of clash of understanding overall, because it's a hijacked tagline, if you ask me. And it's a hijacked tagline that can be very, very successful depending on the kind of population you are speaking to. So I think slightly older, maybe 45 and above, almost 50 and above voters in urban spaces, yeah, that's a great thing, because it's horrible what's happening to the state. We don't want corruption, we don't want a foreigner here. But it means completely different in the rural areas. It means completely different outside urban spaces.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there is such a barrage of questions, which I take as indication of a lot of interest. Our time is running short, but I want to ask one question just to Arno, and then we can wrap up question to both of you, the broader panning out to the broader context of Sabah election and context of Malaysia. So, but I think this is touching on one of the questions that was raised, and I know with Arno, your recent piece has explain, right, the constitutional changes in Sabah, which give a lot of supreme powers to the governor to appoint the chief minister. So how is that kind of playing out right now, heading in towards the election? That is, the governor, TYT, Tuan Yang Dipertua, right, has full discretion. So yeah, do you see, what can you comment on that at this point, briefly?
Yeah, a lot of people are hoping for the current governor to play the role of a benevolent and fair and just governor. They just want the governor to play this role because Sabah politics has been in a mess for many, many years. So they hope that a figure is there to stabilize the way things are going on. So that's the hope of many Sabahans. Some Sabahans, they really don't care because he belonged to the same elites who ruled the state before, right? But some, I think, they put a lot of hope on him to stabilize our messy political situation. So what happened after that? We do not know what maneuvers are going to be used to maintain the power of the ruling elites. That's happening behind closed door. That one I'm not privy to comment on. Yeah.
All right, I'll just text you then.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's wrap up with a round of reflections on Sabah. You know, this is maybe the second time, or they could have been further back in time, but most of the recent decades, Sabah election was concurrent, state election concurred simultaneously with federal. Sarawak was the one that was out of sync, but now Sabah is out of, it's not synchronized, but so are a few other states. So it's not really that exceptional. But despite all of that, right, it is the first. How do you think that, is Sabah a bellwether, and do people feel that this is an opportunity to send a signal? Do voters feel that this is send a signal to the federal government? First question. Maybe that one I could direct to Vila and Arnold. I think you are a little bit more, involved in thinking about and researching about party politics and the federal and state. So how do you see the federal government, administration positioning itself for this election?
Who first, on Villa or Anna?
Vila.
Villa first kah?
Go first.
Okay lah, saya jawab dulu So thanks for that. I think ultimately my takeaway is that at this very moment there's really no clear majority win. There's no clear strongman in the story just yet. There are a few, and even with whatever anybody says about Haji J, I also agree with Arnold. From the time they took over, I think they have made some sort of steady improvement and development in certain parts, not always, but in certain parts. And I think ultimately, because there's this expectation that there is always going to be some kind of hidden or obvious corruption that's happening in these parts of in Sabah, is that at least some part of those resources and allocations get returned to the state. I think in order to sort of in order for an Anwar federal state alignment to continue to exist, and this is purely based off what I've seen, is that I think the conversation, or lots of people believe that JRS has to retain power, and I think that goes without saying. But I also can see the ways in which Warisan is going to make a rebound. And while it might be unclear at the moment, Sabah is in a state of chaos. I mean, it always is, but at this particular moment, it's in a state of massive chaos. Whether due to natural catastrophes, the death of a 13-year-old, or multiple sort of problems with our education system. Young people are angry. So it's in a state. And I think if any political party sort of looking at this, if they're looking at it pragmatically, they have to pay attention to the kind of voter fatigue that is coming in voting in for people in power all the time. And they also have to really weed out the sort of fragmentation that is coming. There will be outcomes to that. And I think ultimately, this kind of language going beyond the Sabah for Sabahan state, and going into a stronger Sabah for stronger Sabahan parties might actually be something to look out for. So if you're asking me whether Sabah is a bellwether, perhaps, but I think limitedly. Sabah is still, at the end of the day, multi-ethnic. It is very migrant heavy. There is a very huge divide between East-West politics. And this is not a perfect ground for prediction for anybody in Peninsular Malaysia. I think they have to pay very close attention. And gone are the days where Sabah is fixed. What do we call that?
Fixed deposit.
A fixed deposit. I think it's gone simply because I think the steamboats that are coming out of anger and resentment is a very powerful tool. So don't ignore an angry person. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Yeah.
No, the last word from you.
Yeah, just a little bit following up on what Vila have just said. I think in this coming election, it does not matter which party you represent. I think people will just support any candidates who can deliver, who can address their basic needs, whether you are independent, whether you are UMNO, or Warisan, or national base, local base. I don't think people really look into that, especially the young generation, the 18, the fence sitters. They will vote for candidates, for calon who can deliver and deliver tangible benefits. I think that's for sure. And when it comes to federal state relations, I believe Anwar wants to strengthen PKR in Sabah. I believe Anwar also wants to integrate Sabah into the larger Malaysian Federation. Following his speeches, understanding what is written in Anwar's book and his conversation with state leaders, I believe he does not want Sabah. I think this is just my opinion. He does not want Sabah to be as strong as Sarawak. I think that's the case. I believe he does not want the Borneo blocks to be realized. That is why he wants PKR to be strong, PH to be strong in Sabah. Whether he can do that, we're not too sure. But one thing is certain is that he will try to contest in at least 20 seats in Sabah in order to realize PKR's mission to spearhead his influence throughout Sabah. We'll see whether he is successful in doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks.
sharing. Yes, that was a bit provocative, but it's grounded, in your analysis, and I think supported by some of what you pointed to. Well, alas, we have come to the end of our time. I think we did a bit of Sabah elastic time with this but I've been just really soaking in all this insights and sharing from your own observation, and I think being Sabahans, you know your state so intimately. And the question didn't arise about when is it happening. Well, I suppose because we don't really know, and it's in any case at the very latest it will be dissolved in November, and then the election, but no later than 60 days after the assembly is dissolved.
Yep.
And so please look out for our webinar after the election, where we will look at the results. And also for the Malaysia Studies program on October 24th, we're having our next webinar where we will be unpacking the federal budget 2026. So 24th October, we hope to see you there. So thank you so much, Dr. Anu Puyok, Dr. Vila Somia, Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but our very warm and friendly and effervescent Sabahans and congenial Sabahans will be glad to receive your questions by email, I'm sure. And so please feel free to keep up the conversations after this in various other channels. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Dr. Hodan, Ponsiko, bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Villa. Thank you, On.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Arnold.
everyone.
Bye, Hoan.